Please, let's give a warm Pachyderm welcome to Bill Goffrier.
Thank you, Bob. I sound pretty successful from all that. Everything pretty accurate. Thank you for bringing that prop painting because I wanted to come travel light. I think I brought a pencil and some extra business cards. And my iPhone is also a prop, so we'll see if that comes in handy. Oh, and then I used the pointer. I feel honored to be here. I think this is fantastic. Thank you all for having me. So I hope I can keep this interesting for you. You know that we're talking about paintings, I hope. I won't have to re-say that too many times. But this word, authenticity, I kind of created that word. And I have to pronounce it for people. So authenticity, and spell it that way. And it's just, I wanted to come up with kind of a handle for this painting series that I started about 5 years ago. Didn't start with that name, didn't start with a lot of ambition like that, but it's what it sort of evolved into. And this is one of the larger paintings. Oh, let's use the pointer. Let's see how that works. You see the Ambassador Hotel, and isn't it the Ruffin building that we're in now? A view from the walkway that I decided, I do a lot of scouting around Wichita, and eventually I come up with a view that I think does justice to the subject, or I might encounter it accidentally, frankly, and just be at the right place at the right time and say, that needs to be one of the paintings. So this actually is one of the key paintings of the series because it's 3 feet tall, it's 2 feet wide, and that's much larger than like this one that Bob has. And frankly, most of them were more like the small size. That was part of the strategy of it. So authenticity. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Okay. I chose this one. This was kind of already put together as a little promo card. It was for a recent First Friday event at Garvey Center, Kiva, which is another really fun space to be a part of, I've discovered. It mentions wrong button. It mentions the fact that I paint in oils, and if you have any questions about why that is, I may even refer back to that too. But all oil paintings, all about Wichita as a city. I think it's become kind of a celebration of Wichita, in a way. And I have been painting for about 50 years, I guess. So Bob, I don't know where Bob got his numbers, but about 50 years. And maybe that'll come up again too. So, Davis Building at Friends University. Very iconic image. That was the second painting I did of it, actually, because the first view was just something I liked, and it wasn't like the iconic view. So a lot of people suggested to me that they wanted the facade, so to speak, and that was a challenge. It's kind of a different type of view than a lot of the paintings. And, of course, the Garvey Center, or what I always thought of as the Holiday Inn, and another Wichita icon, obviously. And that was a very small painting, too. I've been asked, mostly by Bob, frequently, why a painting over a photograph of the same subject? And that's not easy for me to answer. In fact, I kind of stepped aside. I put that question to my Facebook followers. I use that a lot, and got over 80 comments about it, people coming up with some. I was going to quote one, and now I don't have the card to actually to do the quote from it. But for the most part, people explained how they preferred a painting over a photograph based on the idea that they could get kind of reeled in and caught up in the painting, become involved in it because they saw how much they thought the artist was involved in the subject. They may go so far as to study each brush mark and the texture and every detail. One of my friends, also a customer and now a new friend, and she reminded me, she's actually literally goes up to my paintings with a magnifying glass and tries to see what's really going on in there. So let's see. Oh, let's not go. let's not go yet. Let's use the pointer. So this was from a show at City Arts early in this year. And it shows people kind of appreciating the paintings, and well, that's me. So you can see people getting involved in paintings. I appreciate that a lot of people can still do that. We live in a much faster paced world now, and I know it's not as easy, but some people will still be patient enough and take the time to get caught up in a painting like they do. Not so much this guy. This example, okay, this is also from one of my paintings that's small like this, but it's even a smaller portion, of a detail portion, and again, there's the Garvey Center. I showed it because it depicts the textures a little bit more than you would see hanging on the wall, unless you do go up to it with a magnifying glass. But I think my paintings are, on that scale, they're kind of loose. They're not that tight, really, and you can see texture and brush marks, and that's what I experienced as a young boy. I was here, I would go to the Wichita Art Museum, I would see paintings by an artist like Edward Hopper, and the realism and the light and shadow, and it would draw me in. I could spend hours there if I was allowed to, and I would just look at that painting, and I'd feel like I could get in touch with the artist's thinking process and follow every mark, and how they were interpreting the subject that they may have seen firsthand, or however, or they may have imagined it. But the way they put it together, I loved being able to follow that. And I decided I wanted to also create that feeling for other people, try to create artwork that would allow other people to have that experience. So here's young Bill. My first oil painting. I had a teacher, beloved in Wichita, Betty Dickerson, at the Wichita Art Association, and her husband Bill. I didn't even appreciate at the time that they are very significant figures in Wichita art history, both painters, and later I realized that Bill Dickerson, or William Dickerson, was one of my favorite regional realist oil painters and watercolorist and printmaker and all these things. And he actually made a hand-carved frame for this painting, but that was routine for Betty's students. He would frame perhaps their first ever oil painting, one of his handmade frames, and that's the way it went on the wall in the Goffrier house. And I still have it to this day. And then in high school, probably my favorite teacher of all time, Don Weddle, was an artist from Lindsborg, and devoted a lot of time teaching art at Southeast High School back in the 70s and maybe later. He gave me a chance to, it was very traditional as far as high school art. I could draw from still lifes and paint from still lifes, which I set up the objects and I set up the light and shadow, and that's what I really was studying. Self-portrait, I think I must have done that at home as kind of an extra project, and we won't go into all the text of that, but somehow that ended up in the newspaper. But it was because I won some Scholastic Art Awards, which my parents were so proud of that, and it even with Don Weddle's help, that even led to scholarship opportunity. I could have gone off to St. Louis and Washington University. Didn't really want to leave Wichita yet, so I stuck around. I went to WSU instead. And in fact, I ended up for a time sharing studio space on the second floor of what we call the Flatiron Building, Wichita's Flatiron Building at 21st and Broadway. I'm glad that it's still there. So I've painted it a number of times, but I also, in those days, I'd look out my window like this and maybe go out around the area, and that's the north side, the kind of the gritty side of Wichita. It smelled bad. The stockyards were still there. I was attracted to some of the most clumsy and bulky and not pretty places, but I identified with that. Maybe a lot of young people do, but I was an awkward teenager, kind of a misfit as an artist anyway, and so I liked finding what I thought could be beautiful in places that other people would would wonder, why would you paint that? Well, but these are very early. There's a drawing, and there's a gouache painting, which is a type of watercolor that's opaque rather than transparent. So, as Bob mentioned, I went to Boston, and it was a little bit after that period to finally commit to getting a master's degree, again in painting. I had dreams of being just a famous artist, possibly. I'm pretty naive about that. But I would always come back to, look at that. I always come back to Wichita, see my parents were still here, and a lot of friends that I had over the years. I'd use whatever technique I was trying at the time, watercolor in this case, come back and find a favorite grain elevator and set up and paint that. And I think I painted that one on location, even though it's, as far as watercolors go, it's big. But I love to paint plein air and on location. And every time I came back, it might be a different style. I was going through a lot of periods, thanks to my Boston University education, some great professors, and some very great classes in traditional painting, but it sent me off in all kinds of different directions. I didn't know what kind of painter I was actually supposed to be. I really had kind of lost myself. At some points I stopped painting completely and turned back to music and things like that, but eventually came back to painting. I always felt like a Kansan, even after all those years. In fact, by the time we came back, my new family, in 2013, I realized I'd actually been in Boston or in New England more of my life than I had ever been in Kansas. So I still felt like a Kansan, but the math didn't really work out to that. The Goffrier family, since Bob already touched on that, I'm really only showing it because of the outfit I'm wearing. Check that out. Okay, we're all Henry's wardrobe. Very very stylish family. And Bill Jr. Actually that's here because he's the reason we came back. Take care of him, be a caregiver. He was the last of the Goffrier family at that point, and he needed help, and that's what we do. So once we got settled in, I kind of resumed my habit of showing very independently. I'd been doing that over those 30 years too. Wherever there was a chance, not just entering a painting in maybe a juried show, as often happens, and then try to get in a competitive show, but really just set up my own shows, watermark books and places around town that I could just put up a bunch of work, make sure as many people saw it as possible, and that was my approach. I really always wanted to be directly reaching people that way. And so these were chosen, I'm not used to this clicker, you can see. These were chosen because Reverie Coffee, the original location, was one of the first places that I was able to start showing again, work that I kind of already had around and hadn't really had a chance to do much new work yet. But my wife Carly had a great idea. She noticed right away that people were interested in my artwork and people would buy my artwork, but it looked like it was more difficult for them to buy larger paintings and more expensive paintings. She suggested that I focus on small paintings. I had to get over that maybe artist attitude that if you're a serious artist, if you're going to be an important artist, you need these huge paintings. You need to fill up a museum space, and that's great. But I didn't like doing that anyway. So it didn't take much convincing, and I started doing these small paintings, and actually that is one of the small paintings. When it happened a little later on in the series, I think I was getting ready to have a second or third show back at Reverie, so I wanted to do something appropriate for that. And just taking work into any space that I could find available, and set up as best I could and go from there. It was very rewarding, but also at the same time, the series was taking off with these small paintings. I was selling them pretty quickly, I came to find. And so that was motivating. I was literally on the street. I'd typically go out on my little scooter. I'd left my Jeep behind in Massachusetts, so I got one of those 30-mile-an-hour scooters and commuted on that, and then wandered through downtown, and it enabled me to find views that I hadn't really expected, but I also went back to places that I was fond of from my youth too, and so there I was painting on the street, the first attempt at the historical museum, and there was a picture like that ended up in the newspaper. Apparently it's big news. Report of someone actually painting outside on the street. It made the news. So, and social media figured really heavily into this series. That's a very unlikely business model. Facebook was not designed for business in the first place, and certainly not really designed for artists to make a business out of that. Very unlikely. I was using Facebook for the typical reasons, getting in touch with old friends and sharing, personal images and things like that, activities. But I started sharing these paintings. Let's see, I don't know if I can actually read it on here. When I posted it in 2014, and it said, I can't read it from here, but referring to, this is what I did this morning. Maybe took me 3 hours. It had to be a one-time painting while the light hadn't shifted too much, And I brought it home and put it up, and somebody wanted to buy it, and I thought, wow, if we can continue that, was that just some out of the blue, once in a lifetime thing? But actually that happened pretty consistently, and it was very encouraging. Let's see. Well, I guess the reason I'm kind of skipping to this and the meaning of that phrase, multiple exposures, I didn't want to forget to mention that the transition that I had from painting on the street, and then what would happen to save time initially, instead of bringing a sketchbook, which I was accustomed to, and doing a little preliminary sketch, thumbnail sketch, before I painted, because I wanted to make sure I had organized my idea. Instead, I would just go to the iPhone, take several pictures if need be, and then decide on the right view, frame it, crop it if need be, get a composition there, and then jump right into the painting. And those pictures didn't mean much beyond that until I started not finishing my paintings while I was there. That I was evolving, and I was wanting more detail. I was pushing myself a little bit. The sizes were increasing a little bit. So when I took them home to try to finish that up, I needed some reference. Of course, I would go back to those photos, and if I was lucky, I would find the information that I needed. And I didn't expect to be that successful at it, because I had grown to really detest painting from photographs, but because my experience with that was 35 millimeter film cameras and taking pictures and not even knowing what I got until much later, and it was always disappointing. But I found that with the iPhone, without even really thinking about it that much, I would get multiple exposures, literally. I would sometimes get a lighter view of the subject, sometimes a darker view. I realized that I could control that really well, actually, because when you point the camera at the sky, the camera adjusts to where you're getting you end up with a darker result. So the sky may look pretty accurate to the way your eyes see it, but the rest of the subject matter, especially shadow areas, would be completely blacked out, completely dark. And that's not the way it looks to your eyes. But the opposite photo you could take, if you pointed the lens at the shadow area, you'd get a light exposure. You'd start to see what's really happening in those shadows. And I would need both, actually, to recreate my experience there. So it works the same way as our eyes work. When you look at the sky and your eyes adjust to that light, and then you look at a darker area, and again, you get that adjustment. So it became a much more natural way for me to feel like I was still in touch with the subject. couple of examples just because, this shadow area was important to me to describe, but it would have been a really, really dark area in just one given photo. And the same with Riverside Cottage. Let's see, this is Oakland Street in College Hill, in case anybody's wondering about that. And to preface this by saying, a lot of people still mistake my paintings for photographs, in person or on social media even. And, I take that as a compliment. It's not always what I want people to, I don't really want to be having them mistaken for photographs, of course. So I try to get people to look a little closer. And one thing that I think should make more of a difference is the idea of a limited palette refers to, I don't have every color, every pigment on my palette literally to match the colors that I'm seeing. I purposefully reduce it to as few as possible. There's always going to be white on there to make tints of colors. But then when it comes to the pure hues, if you think of the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, if you have those in a pure form, you can virtually create every other color of the rainbow, and you can create neutrals from more opposite colors. But I don't even like to necessarily take it that far. In something like this downtown view where it's mostly earth tones, and obviously the blue of Century 2, which was repeated in the sky, that was an important pure hue. So I might start my color selection when I'm choosing what paints do I want to put on my palette. I need the right blue, and then I might pick a few earth tones. I realize I don't need a strong red, I don't need a strong yellow. I just put a few colors there, and then when I can get those key colors that are important to me, the rest of it is more a matter of neutrals, a lot of just mixing of colors. I use a lot of very muddy colors, frankly, and that's something that when you learn art, you take art courses, you're always afraid of that mud effect, but I use a lot of muddy colors. I enjoy just a slight variation between them. The Maple Grove Cemetery subject, it's just another example of very limited palette when I realize that besides the strong blue and some very saturated greens, which are mixed from the blue and a yellow, then the red portion of the triad of colors isn't really anything strong in there. It's really just a very subtle earthy red. Okay, we'll get into perspective. I know there's something Bob wanted to, well, he had a few questions about this, so I hope this will help too. Perspective, there's many ways to talk about it and look at it. This is just a introductory example of location at Douglas and Meade Street. It doesn't look like this anymore. That view no longer exists. Those trees are not there, and those columns are not there. Atmospheric perspective is an effect I push and maybe exaggerate. You see it in real life, and you see it in camera images too, but what I'll point out is that the way an artist can use it and push the boundaries of it a little bit is to create more of a three-dimensional space, not let your painting be so flat, create that illusion. You can manipulate colors, especially as they go to a great distance, as they go to the horizon. The atmosphere affects the hue and the contrast or the value. So every color becomes more blue, has a more blue effect to it, to the point where you get those exactly blue kinds of building silhouettes or mountains, certainly if you have a mountain view. And the contrast converges toward the middle. Things become kind of a middle gray. There's no strong white or black in that great distance. And that's a way to suggest that the great distance, as opposed to something that's even just a little bit more in the foreground, like the black of that traffic light pole. That's a little slice of the background of the first painting that was on the screen, the Ambassador Hotel painting. So that's just a distant view down Broadway, I guess it would be. And I included this one because it's a little bit offbeat. I'm not always focusing on buildings and architecture, but there's a little bit of that atmospheric perspective that was pretty important to me in here, because it allowed me to separate the space between all of the flags and all this commotion and bright colors that are happening on the top of the wind wagon against the background of, I think it's Garvey Center still, the background building. I had to make sure I pushed that farther back. And so subduing the values and also the colors, making it just cool gray, and making sure there was no strong white even in the sunlit parts of the building, helped me explain what was actually going on there in space. So a photograph wouldn't really show it that way. Now, okay. Many times I've painted Century 2, and people keep reminding me to make sure I document that. But this one, my favorite one, just as important as the building in this one was the street to me, the foreground. And so it's an example of linear perspective. And if you see the lines all going back at diagonals, suggesting that they would all converge somewhere on the horizon. They would all meet at one point, and that's the meaning of the one-point perspective. That's what you're really basing the three-dimensional illusion on. I don't do it with like technical measuring, or the way I taught it, the way that you would do an architectural rendering or an interior design drawing, very technical means. I never did that much on my own for my artwork. It's always been more observational. So at the most, I would maybe take my pencil or my paintbrush, anything like this, and just kind of look at the angles, really. Judge the vertical and the horizontal and the tricky, very subtle changes of angle. And when I eyeball those and I have those fixed in my head, it helps me organize what's happening to make those lines look like they would be going to a vanishing point, because there's nothing actually depicted in there. The vanishing point isn't shown. Oh, and I don't even always paint buildings. In this example, I like to paint airplanes. Anything that you can find kind of sitting around the city for long enough. I forget the name of this airplane, but I do remember that it was tornado damaged. It's on the property of the Aviation Museum, and that, again, kind of broken down things like that appeal to me. So I thought this was a really fun subject. But it's just another example of one-point perspective, the lines of the wing to help show that it's jutting out. Those lines have to be seeming to converge at one point on the horizon. And of course there's some atmospheric perspective happening in the way that that distant horizon is painted, so it is pushed back. And what you see as far as, maybe even what you think of as far as perspective in artwork or in photos, is probably two-point perspective, because if you have perpendicular walls and you're not looking at it straight on, then you're seeing, in one direction they're going toward one vanishing point and the other wall's going toward a second vanishing point. And so that's something that I try to recreate a lot. Or, well, I have to if I want to make it a believable illusion. But it's really by eyeballing it, and the more windows, the more architectural detail there happens to be in the subject, the more I have to really slow down and do actual measuring in order to make it convincing enough. I don't like to smooth over those kind of things or simplify it too much, especially as I've gone in this series and been able to take on subjects that I would have been intimidated to to paint early on because they involve so much detail. Well, I've gotten used to just sucking it up and confronting that detail and working through it. Linear perspective can even go as far as three-point perspective. This is, I think, one of my, I don't want to say failed paintings in the series, but I was least satisfied with this. I was experimenting a little because I was working from my own photographs, and there were a series of them, and I even painted this a different way before this one, where it wasn't so tilted. But what happens, especially with an iPhone camera, whenever you're not keeping the camera pointed exactly level straight, you're going to get an exaggeration of that tilt effect. The keystone effect, right, Bob? We were having to adjust the projector and the image to compensate for that tilt. And you can actually, now I learned, you can get an app on your iPhone, and it will make that adjustment and take that tilt away. But I had a series of photos, and I was interested in the fact that really awkward tilt. But having painted it, I realized, I don't like the fact that it reminds me so much that it was based on a photograph with that much distortion to it. So I typically eliminate that. Even if the photo has that tilt, I'm going to straighten it out when it comes to painting it. So I'm not tied to the photograph.
Looks like you painted that in Italy, the Leaning Tower.
Oh, yes, thank you. Well, getting into another interesting development in this series really fascinated me. So much of Wichita history I've learned from doing this series. I didn't know it beforehand. I'm not a Wichita historian in any sense. But the longer this went on, people would warn me or alert me. Like in the case of Lawrence Dumont Stadium, they're about to tear it down. You better get there. This is your last chance. And actually, it was literally the last day that the public was allowed in. I took my granddaughter, who's here today, and she's actually, I don't think you can see it on this scale, but she's in the painting, kind of wandering around in the empty seats back in the back. We had a blast that day, and I took, probably dozens of photographs, and then figured out how I wanted to do something to memorialize the stadium. And I knew it would be kind of a popular image, but it turned out to be much more popular than I would have expected. People have a love and a passion for that. So I was thinking about the history aspect of it, because I didn't used to appreciate that Wichita even had that much history to it. I thought Wichita's not old enough, barely 100 years old when I'm thinking back, and that's not history, that doesn't count. But nowadays I think of it as like, the good old days of 2018, when we used to be able to go to Lawrence Dumont Stadium and see an old-fashioned baseball game. Remember the old Eagle and Beacon building where they printed the newspaper? There wasn't much left of it at this point. And that's my preference again for not pretty subjects. But I did paint the whole building before it was halfway demolished. And Meade's Corner, a lot of people miss that. A lot of people are upset that that wasn't preserved. It's only been a few months, I think. It's personal. Means I would find out after the fact. I kind of already referred to that, but if I sought out a place that just interested me, because in a way this is kind of an ugly, scary building. I love the architecture, and when I saw it in the wintertime with these bare tree limbs, and it made it even more scary. It reminded me of the Addams Family or something, and that's the way I wanted to paint it. But I found out after the fact that it had a lot of sentimental value to people. People would tell me they got married there, and I heard a lot of great stories, and it became again a pretty popular image. I didn't know anything about it except it looked paintable. I didn't know anything about the Interdale apartment building on North Broadway. And then after this painting, and I exhibited it several times because it's a really large painting too, and I started hearing about all the parties that used to go on in that building. Anybody been to any parties at that building? Because I felt left out. No, I certainly had not been invited to him. And I eventually painted several Cowtown subjects. I'd say I'm probably still in the process of, covering Cowtown enough, but painted the Murdoch house, and all of a sudden I'm hearing from people, I've got to have that painting. I worked on the restoration of that. I put a lot of labor into that, in moving it and then restoring it in this location. Heard some great stories about it. Found out it was haunted. And the College Hill Bridge, well, that was suggested by a customer of mine. I didn't even think that would be paintable. I couldn't figure out how I was going to take that, that subject and work it into a pleasing composition. But the autumn tree helped a lot. My wife discovered that for me just in the nick of time. It was like you had a one-day window to get that color and that view, and then preserve it that way. And I kind of hesitate to tell you what the kind of stories I heard about why this bridge meant so much to people. Apparently there are things that went on down there underneath there, possibly illegal substances. I don't even want to think about it. So leading into this, I hope I haven't gone too long yet. I know I'm getting near the end of my slides, but as the series has grown and these iconic subjects have become more, how should I say it? More people are aware of them. They've been sharing and resharing, and social media has expanded my reach to people, and then sharing things through local history groups, and the demand started to be beyond the paintings, and that was a great development. I found out that I could offer prints of all, well, usually they're the size of the painting. I like to keep it kind of consistent with the size of the painting if it's the smaller ones, or there's that Century 2 painting, so you can see it was kind of a medium-sized one. And it's not like the old days when you have to print up a big expensive edition. An artist doesn't have to risk and invest a lot of money and then hope that they're going to sell an edition, which could take years. Now, thanks to technology, you can make the same quality print literally on demand. I can make one or two, if that may be all that's ever needed or wanted, and they can still be signed. I hand sign them, and they're fine art prints. They're on good art paper. Sometimes they're even on canvas. They're printed on canvas, and they look virtually like an original oil painting on the wall. And I love that I can offer multiples of that subject. Even to the point, well, some people were requesting a print form like a book, but the problem is the series is ongoing, and I'm over 200, but I'm not to 250 yet. So a friend of mine, my webmaster, also knows a lot about printing magazines or catalog formats. So what he convinced me to do was 50 paintings at a time. We've only so far published and printed volume 1, but it seems to work because I can do it 4 volumes for now, and then anticipate being able to do a 5th volume by the time we're ready to do that. And that's an easy way for people to have a handheld copy they can leaf through. And I end up doing a lot of commissions now. So that's a trade-off. I'm not able to just go out and find whatever I want to paint all the time. I'm spending a lot of time on larger paintings, not always. Some commissions are small as well, but it's a compromise that I don't mind making to please a customer, because that in itself is gratifying. But I still prefer to go out and take my own photographs, which these are examples of. I wanted the sunlight to be just at that angle. I didn't want sunlight glaring off the front of this house. I wanted the shadow. And in this case, in a similar way, I didn't want light bathing the whole front of this mansion. I wanted the rhythm of dark and light, and the repetition. And I also wanted the long shadows falling across the front yard. I wanted that definition.
Bill, I'm sorry. As time draws to a close, we've got a couple of folks in here that wanted to ask questions. So
Sure, we can go right to that.
when you're ready.
Well, let's see. I think there's maybe one or two. Let's see. Oh, how long did that take? Well, I don't know. But sometimes I say 50 years because I had to learn enough to be able to do that. No, about one of those one-time session outside 3 or 4 hours, or several weeks in my studio of fine-tuning it, because that's a much larger painting and it belongs to one of the club members here today. We'll just leave that up because it has some social media and contact information.
Got a question right here.
Okay, very good. Next two questions.
Sure.
It seems like it'd be tougher to do a small painting rather than a large one. Okay, and also, that small one on your desk, can that be done in like 50 hours? I'm throwing one on the wall.
What, this one?
How many hours would it take to do that?
Well, see, that's more in the, I won't say like the 3 to 4 hour one, because by the time I did this one, I was wanting to take them back to my studio and be able to refine the detail a lot more. So, maybe 2 or 3 sessions like that, because I also work in stages where, I might have to lay down the sky and then, if possible, let it dry a bit before I want to go into that area and try to do something completely different or something detailed when that paint is still wet.
Okay,
But the big ones take a lot longer than the small ones.
but are they more difficult? Is it more difficult?
They're more difficult because on that scale, I'm having to include a lot more detail than if I did the same subject small.
Okay.
I can simplify, but not on a large scale.
Quick question, there are some retired politicians, Churchill and George W. Bush to name two, who've taken up painting as a kind of a post-political hobby or activity. Do you have any comments about painting as a hobby for amateurs and the fact that seems to be something that some retired politicians seem to find a good way of relaxing?
Well, I don't know how the politician part of it, works into that, but in general, and I'm really glad you asked that because I kind of skipped over. Literally, for me, painting became therapy. Not so much physical, but kind of emotional therapy. And I think, if it's done with a certain attitude, it's a almost a meditative kind of process, and that's what I had to discover over 50 years of doing it. I didn't used to handle it that way, but when I got to the point where it became meditative and relaxing, and it is now, that's a great motivation to paint, whether you are expecting to show your work or be a professional or not.
Question back here.
You have a studio. Would you tell us about that location? And did you do this for a living?
Great question. I work out of my home. We just rent a home. We didn't know how long we'd be able to stay in Kansas this time, and luckily we have a large dry basement. So my studio and even a private gallery is just in our home, and that's great because I never know exactly when I'm going to be able to put the hours in, and I can come and go quickly. And yes, I do this for a living. I guess I do it full time as much as I can.
Can you share with us who your favorite painter is?
Oh.
And your favorite painting, and you have a world scale or canvas scale?
I don't have a favorite painting. I'm a big Vincent van Gogh fan, but I wouldn't obviously pick his most well-known painting, Starry Night or the Sunflowers. I wouldn't be able to narrow it down. But between Vincent van Gogh and someone like Edward Hopper, but in his case, I like more of his architectural realism more than his narrative paintings of people. And someone that you might not know so well, Charles Birchfield, a watercolorist, known for watercolors, and his work in the Wichita Art Museum was another type of art I was exposed to as a child, and for some reason that just connected with me, and I still seek that out every chance I get.
Bill Goffrier.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Merry Christmas to everyone.